In this video, I'm going to talk about fluence in the skin and how it varies with wavelength and why this may stop treatments from being successful. So the fluence is essentially the concentration of any light energy on the skin surface and within the skin. However, it changes with depth as you go deeper. This is mostly due to absorption and scattering events that occur within the skin, but also due to backscattering when the light comes back on itself towards the skin surface. This can have an effect of either increasing the total fluence in the upper dermis, or in some cases with some wavelengths, the light energy will actually leave the skin completely. So if we look at backscattering, what does this mean exactly? Let's say you fire some red light energy into the skin like this. A portion of that energy will be backscattered. Essentially what that means is that the photons undergo a sufficient number of scattering events such that they effectively turn direction and start to head back towards the surface. Some of them will be heading sideways, some are scattered forward, but depending on the wavelength, the amount of backscattering can be significant. With some red wavelengths, you're looking at potentially 60% of the incident light is backscattered towards the surface. And what that means is that the fluence that's being backscattered towards the surface will meet the fluence which is still incoming or incident into the skin, and therefore you get an addition of these fluences, typically in the top part of the dermis and in the epidermis. So how does the fluence vary with the wavelength that we're firing into the skin? Well, if we look at four wavelengths, we've got the 532 nanometers, which is the frequency doubled neodymium YAG wavelength, the 755 nanometers, which is the alexandrite, 810 nanometers, which is the diode lasers, which are typically used for hair removal these days, and the 1064, which is the fundamental of the neodymium YAG laser. So if we fired 1 joule per square centimeter at the skin surface, how much of that fluence reaches the various depths? Well, with the 532 wavelength, at 1 millimeter depth, the fluence has dropped to 0.43 joules per square centimeter already. At 2 millimeters, it's dropped down to 0.11. At 1 millimeter, it's dropped down to 1% of the fluence at the skin surface. And by the time you get down to 4 millimeters, there's virtually no fluence at all left from that particular wavelength. So you can see that the 532 nanometer beam doesn't really get a lot of energy deep into the skin at all. Whereas the 755 is quite different. At 1 millimeter depth, we can see that the fluence is now 1.4 joules per square centimeter, which is greater than the value at the skin surface. Now this is counterintuitive. You wouldn't imagine that you could get more fluence down deep compared to the surface, but the reason is because there's a lot of the light energy is flying back towards the skin surface and is meeting the energy which is still going into the skin, and it's that this accumulation of the forward and back scattering light which adds up to 1.4 joules per square centimeter at that depth. Then when you get down to 2 millimeters depth, the fluence has dropped to 0.68 joules per square centimeter, and then it's down to 0.35 at 3 millimeters, and then 0.275 at 4 millimeters depth. So you can see already the difference between the 532 beam and the 755 beam is quite significant. Whereas the 532 energy really doesn't get too deep at all, the 755 is still delivering a fairly significant amount of energy, amount of fluence, down to the deeper parts of the dermis. Now we find that the 810 nanometer beam is almost identical to the 755 beam, and that's not surprising given it's only 55 nanometers difference. 55 nanometers is not an awful lot of difference, to be honest. So the values of the fluence at different depths is almost identical. And then when we get to 1064 nanometers, we find that it's slightly less than both the 755 and 810 nanometer beams. Now the reason that these are all similar and very close is because the absorption and scattering coefficients of the skin at all three wavelengths is almost identical. They're very, very similar. There is a big difference, which I will tell you about in a minute or two, but in terms of purely the skin, the epidermis and the dermis, there's not much difference between these wavelengths when it comes to the absorption and scattering coefficients, and that's why they're all very similar. So let's now apply 10 joules per square centimetre at the skin surface and see what happens to the fluences in the skin. Now, with the 532 wavelength, we can see that at 1 millimetre depth, that the incident fluence of 10 is now dropped to 4.3 joules per square centimetre, but at 755 nanometers, it's jumped up to 14, which is a little bit counterintuitive. You wouldn't expect that. But what's happened here is that the light energy, which is proceeding deep into the skin, is meeting some of the backscattered light energy, which is now emerging out towards the skin surface. And those fluences are accumulative, so you can add them up. So at this depth, 755 nanometers, it's the fluence at that point is 14 joules per square centimetre. The same with the 810 nanometer beam 2. And 1064 is just a little bit less. It's not much of a difference because of the absorption and scattering coefficients. With the 532 beam at a depth of 2 millimeters, it's now dropped to 1.1, so it's just slightly more than 10%, 11% in fact, of the incident value. Whereas the 755 and 810 beams, the fluence has dropped to 6.8 and it's about 6.6 with 1064. At 3 millimeters depth, the 532 has now dropped to 0.1 joule per square centimetre, so it's a very low value. Whereas with 755 and 810 it's 3.5 and about 3.3 with 1064. And by the time we get down to 4 millimeters depth, the 10 joules per square centimetre at the surface has reached virtually zero. Almost none of that energy will reach that depth. And this is basically because of scattering and absorption mostly in the dermis. Whereas the 755 and 810 nanometer beams, they'll fall to about 2.75 joules per square centimetre, whereas the 1064 has fallen to about 2.3 joules per square centimetre. So you can see that there's a significant difference, particularly between the green 532 beam and the red or infrared 755, 810 and 1064 beams. The red lights definitely will deliver more energy to the deeper part of the dermis, whereas the green light just cannot. And I'll explain why that is just in a wee second. So, why does this affect some treatments, and in particular, why does it stop treatments from working properly? Well, if we consider that there is a target in the dermis somewhere at some depth that needs to be hit with a minimum fluence of 5 joules per square centimetre, then if we fire 10 joules per square centimetre at the skin surface, we now know that with a 532 beam, we will not penetrate deeper than 1 millimetre with 5 joules per square centimetre. So anything deeper than 1 millimetre, we will not have a positive beneficial effect because we can't get the energy down there. With the other wavelengths, the infrared wavelengths, we can get down to about maybe 2.5 millimetres and be able to deliver a 5 joule per square centimetre fluence. But anything deeper than that will not be properly treated because there's no energy or insufficient energy or fluence reaching those targets, the deeper levels. So we've got to be aware that as you fire your fluence into the skin, it does drop fairly rapidly with depth. If you're looking at hair follicles, in particular in the late anagen stage, then these follicles may be 4 to 5 millimeters deep. By this point, they usually have reached the subcutis level, so they are quite deep. If they were to receive, let's say, a minimum of 10 joules per square centimetre to properly cook all the proteins, then these calculations reveal that with the 755 and 810 nanometer beams, we would need a minimum surface fluence of 36.4 joules per square centimetre. With the 1064 YAG beam, you would need a minimum surface fluence of 43.5 joules per square centimetre. And these are the fluences you would need at the skin surface just to be sure that 10 joules per square centimetre reach the depth of 4 millimetres, where some of these targets will definitely be located. So this explains why some treatments just don't work too well, because if your fluence is not high enough at the skin surface, you just will not get sufficient fluence at any sort of depth where the targets may be. And just to add into the mix, make it a bit more complicated, this model does not take account of the skin tone. Your skin tone is essentially a melanin barrier in the basal layer, which is the bottom layer of the epidermis. So you have melanin in that basal layer, then it will absorb some of the energy, some of the fluence at all of these wavelengths. So that layer, the basal layer, essentially steals the fluence and prevents it from reaching into the dermis. And then the 532 beam is also strongly absorbed by hemoglobin, so it will be absorbed in the blood plexus, which where the capillary plexus is at the top part of the dermis. So that will also steal fluence with the 532. The red wavelengths are not so strongly absorbed, they're quite poorly absorbed by blood, so they'll go through the blood plexus relatively easily. But all this explains why deep hairs are quite difficult to treat, because the light energy has got to get through the melanin barrier in the basal layer. It's got to get past any blood that might be in the surface, and you then have to make sure you have enough fluence at the depth that the hairs are located. This indicates that we need higher fluences at the skin surface to increase our success rate. If you don't have sufficiently high fluence, your success rate will not be particularly high either. In terms of the absorption by hair follicle melanin, the 755 nanometer beam is more strongly absorbed than an 810 diode beam, and the 810 diode beam is more strongly absorbed than the 1064 YAG beam. So we have to take this into consideration too. So what this means is that a 1064 beam will need more fluence than an 810 beam, and in turn an 810 beam needs more fluence than a 755 beam just to achieve the same result. So we not only do we consider the depth of the follicles, of the targets that we're trying to reach, but we also need to consider how strongly those targets will absorb the wavelengths that we're firing at them. So let's go back to the skin tone again, just to see what effect this has on the fluence. Well, if we have a very pale skin tone here, I'm calling this skin tone 1, so there's only a relatively small concentration of melanin in the basal layer, then the light will try to penetrate through that layer, but a small amount of the fluence will be absorbed. It might only be a few percent, but it will be absorbed in the basal layer. Incidentally, the basal layer will also absorb any backscattered light too, not just the forward scattering, but also the backscattered. So that means that most of the energy that we fire in will reach the dermis, because the basal layer will not absorb too much of that energy. Now if we look at the other end of the spectrum, where you've got a very dark skin tone, let's call it skin tone 6, then we can see here there's a lot more melanin trying to absorb this light energy, and therefore a greater amount of the fluence will be absorbed in the basal layer of the epidermis. This leads to higher temperatures in the epidermis, particularly in the basal layer, and therefore more pain. So more cooling is required for higher skin tones, darker skin tones, just purely because of the higher amounts of fluence absorbed in the basal layer. Now, if there's more energy absorbed in the epidermis, in the basal layer, because of the high concentration of melanin, then that means that less energy will reach the dermis. So this makes it more difficult to treat darker skinned people, purely because the melanin will steal some of that fluence. And like I said a wee bit earlier, the blood plexus will steal some of the 532 energy too, because it's so strongly absorbed in blood. Not so much with the red light wavelengths. So in summary, the fluence varies quite rapidly with increasing depth. The fluence can either increase or decrease depending on the amount of backscattering that's exhibited. It also varies with the wavelength and the skin tone, changes accordingly. In the lower dermis, the fluence is relatively low for all wavelengths, because by the time that the light energy has gone through the melanin barrier, the blood barrier, has undergone backscattering, etc., then not much of the light energy will actually reach the deep dermis. And that makes it difficult to properly treat any deep targets like hair follicles, tattoo pigment, or blood vessels, deep blood vessels in particular. So I hope this has enlightened you into the strange world of laser tissue interactions and what happens to the fluence as it goes through the skin. It's not that simple. It's quite complex, in fact, and it does vary depending on your skin color and the wavelength too. There's more of my stuff here on mikemurphyblog.com. I hope you enjoyed this, and hopefully you'll have a look at some of my other videos. Thank you very much.